Three women betrayed and left to die in the wild prairie of 1878 by the men they loved. What they do next will shock you, and the twists won't stop until the final moment. It was 1878, and the prairie sprawled out before them like a never-ending sea of gold and green, rippling under a restless wind that carried whispers of secrets. The land was raw and unforgiving, a place that broke the weak and rewarded only those tough enough to face its cruelty. People said it wasn't a place for women, especially not women alone. But that's exactly where Grace, Rose, and Ava found themselves, standing on the edge of survival with no one to lean on but each other. Grace lingered near a dying fire, its embers glowing a faint, tired red against the heavy darkness that pressed in from all sides. The night air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the distant, sharp scent of pine trees carried on the breeze. The silence was so deep it felt alive. Every rustle of grass, every sigh of the wind seemed to hum in her ears. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fabric worn and frayed from months of hard travel. The cold bit at her skin, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was something else, something she couldn't put a name to yet, a feeling that gnawed at her, sharp and restless. Nearby, Rose stirred in her sleep, her face pinched tight with worry even as she rested. She'd been different all day, quieter than usual, her hands trembling as she packed their last bits of food into a small sack. Those hands were usually steady, reliable, hands that could mend a torn shirt or knead dough from nothing. But not today. The night before, her husband Rex had struck her. It wasn't a quick slap, the kind she'd grown used to brushing off. No, this was a full, brutal backhand that sent her crashing to the ground, her lips splitting open. Grace had found her sitting there in the dirt, blood staining the corner of her mouth, her eyes dull and distant. She hadn't cried, though. Rose never cried. She just shook her head when Grace reached for her, like it was nothing new. Ava, the youngest of the three, lay curled up beside Rose, her brow creased in some troubled dream. She'd always been the dreamer, the one who believed in love stories and happy endings. When Sam, her husband, had courted her with soft words and promises, her face had lit up like a child seeing snow for the first time. She'd glowed, her laughter filling their little camp with something close to hope. But that was before. Now, she barely spoke his name, and when she did, it was with a quiet bitterness that seemed to weigh her down. Grace had never trusted their husbands, not one of them. They were men shaped by the prairie's harshness, men who'd learned to survive by turning their hearts to stone. To them, a wife wasn't a partner or a person. She was a tool, something to own, to use, to bend until it broke. Tom, Grace's husband, was the worst of the lot. He'd married her because she was strong, because she could cook a meal from scraps, mend his clothes with a steady hand, and endure the endless days of travel without complaint. He'd never loved her, not even in the beginning. And now, when he looked at her, it was with a sneer, a cold contempt that said he regretted ever tying himself to her. She'd seen that look grow darker lately, and it set her nerves on edge. A twig snapped somewhere in the distance, sharp and sudden. Grace stiffened, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. She squinted into the blackness, her breath catching as she waited for movement. Nothing, just the horses shifting restlessly where they were tied. She let out a slow breath, but the unease didn't leave her. She turned her head toward the wagon, where the men sat around a bigger fire, its warm light casting long shadows across the ground. Their voices were low, too low to catch, but steady, like they were working through something important. Tom's broad shoulders stood out in the glow, his pipe flaring red as he took a slow drag. Rex's thin, sharp face flickered in the firelight, and Sam sat hunched, his eyes darting away whenever Grace looked too long. They'd been like this all evening, whispering, planning. Earlier, when she'd walked close to grab a pot, they'd gone silent, their heads snapping up like she'd caught them at something. That silence stuck with her, heavy and wrong. She couldn't shake it. Kneeling beside Rose, she shook her gently. "Wake up," she whispered, her voice tight. Rose groaned, her eyes fluttering open, hazy with sleep. "What is it?" she mumbled, rubbing her arms against the cold. Something's wrong, Grace said, keeping her voice low. I don't trust them. Rose sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. You never trust them, she said, but there was no bite in her words, just exhaustion. This is different, Grace replied, her tone sharp enough to make Rose pause. She turned to Ava, shaking her too. The girl jolted awake, her wide eyes darting around the dark. What's happening? She asked, her voice small and shaky. Get up, Grace said. We need to listen. They moved carefully, creeping through the shadows toward the wagon, staying low so the grass hid them. The fire's crackle masked their steps, and they stopped just close enough to hear the men's voices, but far enough to stay unseen. Tom's voice came first, low and hard, cutting through the night like a blade. They'll slow us down. They'll get us killed out here. Rex's voice followed, quick and cold. We can't keep hauling them around like dead weight. Sam shifted, his tone softer, uncertain. But if we leave them here, they'll die. Tom took a long drag from his pipe, the smoke curling up into the dark. That's not our problem, he said, his words flat and final. Rose let out a soft, choked gasp. Grace grabbed her wrist, squeezing hard to keep her quiet. The air felt thick, the weight of what they'd heard pressing down on them. These were their husbands, men they'd followed across miles of rough land, men they'd cooked for, mended for, trusted with their lives. And now, those same men were ready to leave them to rot. Ava's breath came fast beside her, sharp little bursts. They wouldn't, she whispered, her voice trembling. They would, Grace said, her words hard and sure, like they'd been carved from the prairie itself. The men stood up. Tom kicked a pile of dirt over their fire, snuffing it out with a hiss. We leave before dawn, he said, brushing his hands off. Rex stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off a burden. And the women? We take the horses, the wagon, all the supplies, Tom replied, his voice steady. Let the prairie deal with them. Sam fidgeted, his hands twisting together. Ava, he started, but Tom cut him off. She's not your problem anymore, he snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grace pulled the others back into the darkness, her heart pounding so loud she could feel it in her throat. They had to move now. Rose clutched her arm, her fingers digging in. What do we do? She whispered, her voice barely there. Grace's mind raced, spinning through their options. They had no weapons, no food, no way to outrun the men on foot. The prairie stretched out in every direction, vast and merciless, ready to swallow them whole if they faltered. We take the horses, she said finally, the plan forming as she spoke. Rose's eyes went wide, her breath catching. They'll hear us. Not if we're careful. Grace shot back, her voice firm. She turned to Ava, who was still trembling. Can you do it? Ava swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she brushed hair from her face. Then she nodded. She'd always been light on her feet, quick to slip away when the men's tempers flared. If anyone could sneak past them, it was her. They moved fast, crouching low as they edged toward the horses. The animals snorted softly, their ears flicking in the dark. Grace reached out, running a steady hand down the neck of the nearest mare, whispering soft words to keep it calm. Easy, girl, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ava stretched for the reins, her fingers brushing the leather, and then a sharp sound cracked through the night. A boot scuffing against stone. Grace spun around, her stomach dropping. Tom stood there, rifle in hand, his grin slow and mean, like a predator cornering its prey. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Ava let out a strangled cry as Sam grabbed her from behind, his arms locking around her waist. He yanked her back toward the wagon, her feet dragging in the dirt. Rose turned to run, but Rex was faster, seizing her arm and twisting it behind her back. She gasped, her knees buckling under the pain. Grace lunged at Tom, her hands outstretched, but he swung the rifle hard. The butt slammed in her face, and she hit the ground with a thud, pain exploding across her cheek. Her vision flashed white, then blurred, the taste of dirt and blood filling her mouth. Tom crouched beside her, his rough fingers gripping her chin and forcing her to look up at him. You always were a stubborn one, he said, his tone almost admiring, like he was impressed she'd dare to fight. Then he shoved her back, letting her head smack against the earth. The world spun, sounds fading in and out. Ava's sobs, Rose's sharp, panicked breaths. Tom stood up, dusting off his hands. "Time to go, boys," he called. The men moved quickly. The horses whinnied as they were untied, the wagon creaking as it rolled forward, its wheels cutting deep grooves into the soft ground. Ava screamed Sam's name, her voice raw and desperate, but he didn't even glance back. Rose sank to her knees, her hands pressed her mouth as she watched the last flickers of firelight disappear with them. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the night, swallowed by the wind's lonely howl. Grace pushed herself up, her head throbbing, blood warm and sticky on her chin. She wiped her split lip with the back of her hand, wincing as the pain flared. She stared into the darkness where the men had gone, her breath slowing, steadying. Rose sobbed beside her, her voice breaking. "They left us." "I know," Grace said, her tone flat, final. Ava knelt in the dirt, her hands fisted in her skirt, her shoulders shaking. "Well, we're going to die out here." Grace looked at her, then at Rose, then at the vast, unforgiving prairie stretching out before them. She lifted her chin, her voice cutting through the despair. "No," she said, "we're going to survive." The night stretched on, long and brutal, the cold seeping deep into their bones as they sat huddled together in the tall grass. They had no fire to warm them, no food to fill their empty stomachs, no shelter to shield them from the wind that whipped across the open land. All they had were the bruises and cuts left by their husbands, and the stark, heavy truth that survival was now theirs to fight for. Grace pressed a hand to her temple, feeling the dried blood crack under her fingers. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest, a mix of fury and disbelief that burned hotter with every breath. Rose sat beside her, her arms wrapped tight around herself, as if she could hold her broken world together by sheer force of will. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her eyes fixed on the ground. Ava shivered next to her, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutching her knees. The silence between them was thick, heavy with everything they didn't need to say. They'd been left for dead, tossed aside like trash by the men they trusted. There was no going back from that. The first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the prairie in a weak, amber glow that did little to chase away the chill. Grace forced herself to her feet, her muscles stiff and sore from the night spent on the hard ground. "We need to move," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "If we stay here, we die." Rose lifted her head, dark circles carved deep under her eyes. "Where are we even going?" she asked, her voice cracking with exhaustion. "There has to be something out there," Grace said, scanning the endless expanse. "Water, shelter, maybe people." She hesitated on that last word, her stomach tightening. People could mean help, or they could mean danger worse than the land itself. Ava let out a bitter laugh, sharp and hollow. "And what if they're just like the ones who left us? Or worse?" Grace knelt in front of her, gripping her shoulders hard enough to make her look up. "We don't have a choice," she said, her eyes locked on Ava's. "We have to try." She glanced at Rose, softening her tone. "We can't just sit here and wait to die." Rose nodded, slow and numb, pulling herself up. Ava stared at Grace for a long moment, then wiped her face and stood, her movements shaky but determined. They started walking, the prairie stretching out wild and empty before them, its beauty hiding its teeth. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and heavy, pressing down on them like a weight. Sweat soaked their dresses, sticking the fabric to their skin. Their mouths grew dry, their tongues sticking to the roofs of their mouths as thirst clawed at them. The wind, once their only companion, now taunted them, whispering hints of water that didn't exist, rustling the grass in a way that sounded almost like a river, until they realized it was nothing. Hours dragged by, each step heavier than the last. Their legs ached, their feet blistered inside their worn boots. Ava stumbled, her knees buckling, and Grace caught her just before she hit the ground. "Keep going," Grace murmured, holding her up. "I can't," Ava whispered, her voice breaking, her eyes glassy with fatigue. Rose wiped her brow, her skin flushed red from the heat. "Grace, we have to stop," she said, her breath coming fast. "We can't keep this up." They collapsed under the crooked branches of a lone tree, its gnarled limbs stretching out like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The shade was thin, barely enough to cut the sun's glare, but it was something. Rose sagged against the rough trunk, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Ava curled up on her side in the dirt, her eyes half closed, her hands limp at her sides. Grace forced herself to stay upright, her back straight, her gaze sweeping the horizon for any sign of hope, anything that could mean they'd make it through this. The prairie was silent, save for the wind and the faint buzz of insects hidden in the grass. Grace's head throbbed, her lips stinging where the blood had dried. She licked it, tasting salt and iron, and winced. They couldn't stay here long. Resting felt like giving up, but they couldn't push much further either. Not like this. She was about to speak, to urge them up again, when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic rustling. Not the wind, something else. Her heart leapt in her throat, pounding hard as she strained to listen. The sound grew louder, steadier, hooves more than one set, moving closer. Panic surged through her, sharp and cold. They had no weapons, no way to fight or run. If it was their husbands coming back, they wouldn't be kind. If it was someone else, she didn't know what to expect. She glanced at Rose and Ava, their faces tight with the same fear. "Stay low," she whispered, crouching down beside them. They waited, holding their breath as the sound closed in. Figures appeared at the crest of the hill, dark shapes against the blazing sun. Tall, lean, riding horses with a grace that spoke of years in the saddle. They wore buckskin, adorned with beads and feathers that glinted in the light. Lakota. Grace's breath caught, her mind racing. She'd heard stories, settlers whispering about their raids, their fierce warriors who struck like lightning and vanished into the wild. But she'd also heard quieter tales, ones told in hushed tones around campfires, of their honor, their deep bond with the land, their strength that didn't bend. And now, here they were, riding straight toward them. The leader reached them first, pulling his horse to a stop a few yards away. His black hair hung long, tied back with a strip of leather, and his eyes were sharp, piercing, taking in every detail as they swept over the three women. His horse shifted beneath him, powerful and restless, its muscles rippling under its coat. Two others rode up behind him. One older, his face lined with years of wisdom, his presence calm and steady like a rock in a storm. The other younger, his body tense, his eyes burning with a fire that made Grace uneasy. They didn't speak, just watched, their silence heavier than words. Grace stood slowly, her legs trembling from exhaustion, but her spine straight. She raised her hands, palms out, showing they were no threat. "We mean no harm," she said, her voice rough and cracked from thirst. The leader's gaze flicked over her bruised face, her torn dress, the desperation clinging to her like dust. He said something, his words unfamiliar, rolling off his tongue in a language she didn't know. It was a question, she could tell from his tone. She swallowed, trying again. "Husband's gone," she said, gesturing to the empty horizon behind them. "Left us. No food, no water." The silence stretched, thick and tense. The young warrior snorted, muttering something to the others, his lip curling in disdain. The older one stayed quiet, his eyes steady on Grace. The leader didn't move, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his stare, curiosity, maybe, or a flicker of pity. Then, without a word, he slid off his horse, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Grace tensed, her hands curling into fists at her sides, but he didn't approach. Instead, he reached for the water skin tied to his hip and tossed it to her. She caught it awkwardly, her fingers fumbling as they closed around the leather. She pulled to stop her free, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped it and tipped it to her lips. The water was cool, sharp, rushing over her dry tongue and down her throat. It hit her like a jolt, so intense she almost fell to her knees. She drank deep, then handed it to Rose, who took it with trembling hands and sipped, her eyes closing as the relief washed over her. Ava went next, gulping it down, water spilling over her chin as she gasped. The leader turned to his men, speaking in low, quick tones. The young one shook his head, his scowl deepening, clearly unhappy. The older one nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then the leader looked back at Grace and gestured toward his horse with a tilt of his head. She understood he was offering help. Her mind spun. Could they trust these strangers? Men they didn't know, from a people they'd only heard about in stories? But what choice did they have? Starve here or take the risk? She met his gaze, searching for any sign of danger, then nodded. The older warrior moved to Rose, offering his hand. She hesitated, then let him help her onto his horse, his movements gentle and patient, like he knew she was fragile. The young one, still glaring, held out a reluctant hand to Ava. She paused, her eyes flicking to Grace, then took it, letting him pull her up behind him. The leader stepped closer to Grace, reaching down from his horse. His grip was firm as he clasped her wrist, pulling her up with an easy strength that surprised her. She settled behind him, her hands resting lightly on his sides, unsure where else to put them. The horses turned, hooves kicking up dust as they rode away from the endless, empty prairie. The journey was long, the land blurring past in streaks of gold and green. The wind whipped at Grace's face, tugging at her hair, but for the first time in days, she didn't feel like she was sinking deeper into despair. She glanced at the man in front of her, the leader. Who was he? Why had he stopped for them? The questions burned in her mind, but she kept them locked away. For now, it was enough that they weren't alone. The Lakota village came into view as they crested a hill, nestled in a wide valley framed by rolling hills and towering pines. Smoke curled up from cooking fires, drifting into the pale morning sky, carrying the rich smell of roasted meat and fresh earth. Children darted between the lodges, their bare feet kicking up dirt as they laughed, their voices bright and carefree. Women moved with quiet grace, tending to tasks, grinding corn, sewing hides, stirring pots over the flames. It was a world alive with sound and motion, so different from the rigid, brutal life the sisters had known. Grace watched it all, her chest tight. Was this safety or just a new kind of trap? They were taken to a small lodge at the camp's edge, made of hides over poles. It was close yet apart, marking them as outsiders. The leader, Noah, she'd heard, brought them here, saying little, his sharp eyes always on them. He left with a nod, but Grace felt him watching still. Rose sat inside the lodge, a borrowed blanket draped over her lap, her fingers tracing its edges absently. The bruise on her cheek was fading, turning yellow at the edges, but the fear in her eyes hadn't dimmed. A Lakota woman, older with kind eyes and strong, weathered hands, had come earlier, pressing a small bundle of herbs into Rose's palm with a gentle nod. Rose had taken them, clutching them tight, but she hadn't spoken, not to thank her, not to anyone. She just sat there, silent, lost in her own head. Ava couldn't stay still. She'd wandered out of the lodge almost as soon as they'd settled, her curiosity pulling her toward the village despite the fear that still clung to her. Grace found her later by the river's edge, her shoes off, her toes dipping into the cool water as she watched a group of young warriors train with their bows. One of them, Luke, the fiery one who'd scowled at them, noticed her. He didn't say anything, but when Ava mimicked his stance, pulling an imaginary bowstring, a smirk tugged at his lips. She turned away, pretending not to care, and he fired an arrow into the sky, its path clean and perfect, slicing through the air like a challenge. Grace saw the way Ava's eyes followed it, a spark of something waking up inside her. Grace didn't know what they were here, guests welcomed with open arms, burdens tolerated out of pity, or prisoners waiting for the bars to close. She'd asked Noah that first night, her voice low as she stood by the fire. "Why are we here?" she'd said, meeting his gaze. He hadn't answered right away, just watched her with that unreadable look of his. Then he'd handed her a small bundle of dried meat and pointed to the fire, a silent command to eat. It was a simple gesture, nothing more, but it unsettled her. Tom had never brought her food unless it came with a price. Some expectation, some demand. She'd learned to distrust kindness from men. Was Noah any different? He hadn't asked for anything yet, but that didn't mean he wouldn't. Days turned into weeks, slow and strange. The Lakota didn't push them away, but they didn't pull them in either. They were left to find their own place, to figure out how to fit into this world that wasn't theirs. Rose started helping the women with small tasks, kneading dough, stirring pots over the fire. Her hands found a rhythm, something familiar to hold on to, and bit by bit, she seemed to come back to herself, though she still didn't talk much. Ava grew bolder, trailing Luke around the camp, asking questions he didn't always answer. She'd tease him, mimicking his movements until he'd scowl and turn away. But Grace noticed he never told her to leave, and sometimes, when she wasn't looking, his scowls softened into something else. Grace stayed alert, always watching for when this fragile peace might break. She couldn't relax, couldn't trust the kindness around her. But sometimes she forgot her fear. She'd sit by the river alone, the water's soft flow calming her mind, easing the weight on her chest. Noah would stand nearby, quiet and steady, like an anchor. She didn't understand why he watched her, but she didn't ask. One night, under a starry sky, he brought her a bough. "You should learn," he said, his voice low. She hesitated, then took it, feeling its weight. "Why?" she asked, but he didn't answer, just motioned for her to try. He stepped close, guiding her hands. "Like this," he murmured. She pulled the string, her arms shaky, and shot. The arrow wobbled, but flew. Noah gave a small smile. Again, she kept going, the night fading into dawn, feeling stronger with each shot. But peace didn't last. One night, shouts broke the silence, angry, sharp. Grace stepped outside, her stomach tight. By the fire, Zane, a cruel-eyed warrior, argued with Noah, pointing at her. Noah stood calm, arms crossed, his voice steady against Zane's rage. Grace knew enough now. Zane didn't want them here, saw them as trouble. The crowd watched, tense. Rose and Ava stood behind her, silent. Luke lingered nearby, jaw clenched, uneasy. Zane's voice grew louder, but Noah stopped him with one word. Zane glared, then stormed off. Noah met Grace's eyes across the fire, something unspoken passing between them. "Stay," he said, not an order, but a choice. She nodded, choosing to trust for once. Days passed quietly, tension simmering. Rose helped the women cook, her hands steadier. Ava followed Luke, teasing him until he scowled, though he never sent her away. Grace stayed cautious, often by the river, where Noah would join her silently. One evening, he brought the bow again. "Practice," he said. She shot, improving, his quiet guidance grounding her. They stayed late, her fear fading as she found strength. But trouble loomed. One stormy day, the sky darkened with heavy, rolling clouds, and shouts erupted again, sharp and urgent, cutting through the rumble of distant thunder. Grace stepped out of the lodge, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest, her breath catching as the wind whipped her hair across her face. Zane faced Noah by the flickering fire, his face twisted with fury, jabbing a finger toward the sisters as he spat harsh words in his native tongue. Noah stood calm, unshaken, his arms crossed over his chest, defending them with a steady voice that barely rose above the growing storm. Then over the howling wind, hoofbeats sounded, close, familiar, a rhythm Grace knew too well. She froze, her blood turning cold. Riders crested the hill, shadows against the lightning-streaked sky. Tom, Rex, Sam, their husbands, back for them, their figures unmistakable even in the dim, chaotic light. Tom smirked, dismounting with a thud, boots sinking into the muddy ground. "Crawled to the savages, huh?" he mocked, eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. Rex spat into the dirt, his lip curling as he swung off his horse. "Time to come home," he growled, his tone cold and unyielding. Noah stepped forward, a solid wall between the men and the women, unshaken. "She's not yours," he said, his voice low but firm, heavy with resolve. Tom laughed harshly, hand twitching toward his pistol, retorting, "She's my wife." Grace clenched her fists and snapped. "You left me," as Tom lunged, only for Noah to intercept, sparking chaos. Gunfire, shouts, and clashing bodies. Grace fell, grabbing a knife. Tom pinned Noah, fist raised. She stabbed him deep. He gasped, staring at her, blood spilling. Noah kicked him off. Tom fell, dying. Rex aimed at her, but Ava's arrow hit his throat. He dropped. The storm raged, washing away the blood. The fight ended fast, as sudden as it had begun. The surviving riders, Sam among them, turned their horses and fled into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by the tempest. Rose collapsed against Grace, sobbing into her shoulder, her tears mixing with the rain as Grace held her tight, her own hands trembling from the weight of what she'd done. Ava stood a few paces away, her bow still clutched in her shaking hands, a shaky, disbelieving laugh escaping her lips as she stared at Rex's lifeless form. Luke watched her from the edge of the firelight, his scowl gone, replaced by a quiet, impressed nod, his dark eyes reflecting the flames. Noah rose to his feet, brushing mud from his knees, and stood by Grace's side, silent but steady, an unspoken understanding in his gaze. She met his eyes, rain dripping from her lashes, her clothes clinging to her skin, and in that moment, her choice crystallized. Not just survival, but a life carved out on her own terms.